inicio al segundo semestre del coloquio doctoral con una inauguración a nivel de grupo, por cierto. Yo no voy a presentar el invitado, lo voy a presentar el alumno del programa doctoral de psicología Roberto Lucha, que me conoce y puede hacerle justicia. Sobre todo agradecerle la presencia y les recuerdo a los alumnos doctorados que hayan recibido mi correo, lo mandé anoche medio tarde, no sé, pero al respecto que se acerquen a hablar conmigo al final de la ¿ya?
Bueno, no es tan fácil hacerle justicia como se dijo, pero voy a tratar. Como cada minuto de exposición del profesor Hofstadter es valioso, pero no tenemos más de 2 minutos acá. Yo creo que todos conocen su trayectoria intelectual, saben de la contribución gigantesca que ha hecho en el campo de la ciencia cognitiva, pero del pensar, y del pensar acerca del pensar. Así que simplemente quisiera decir unas palabras que su amigo, el filósofo Daniel Dennett, usó para definirlo. Creo que son muy pertinentes a nuestra área de interés como psicólogo. Dijo, Douglas Hofstadter es un fenomenólogo, pero es un verdadero fenomenólogo, alguien que hace fenomenología en la práctica. O sea, no es alguien que especula sobre lo que es pensar, está constantemente, con rigor, con pasión, con creatividad, estudiando su propio pensamiento. Es alguien que realmente se fascina en tratar de descubrir los secretos acerca de cómo funcionan sus procesos mentales. Y yo creo que esa es una definición bastante útil para tratar de hacer sentido de la variedad de cosas que ha escrito sobre temas que en apariencia parecen muy diversos. Y en lo que nos va a hablar hoy, se llama la analogía como el corazón del pensar, creo que de alguna manera recapitula un punto central y un hilo conductor de todas las magníficas obras que él ha escrito y que los invito a leer para quienes solo conocen Gödel, Escher-Bach. Es muy importante puntualizar que su obra es mucho más que solo eso, por importante que sea para todos nosotros que lo leemos. Así que sin más, without further delay, los dejo con el profesor Hofstadter.
Thank you. No noise. Can you hear me? No static. Is it okay now? No static. Can you hear me in the back? Yes. I started out in Spanish yesterday for a couple of sentences. I started out in Spanish. I don't want to say the same things in Spanish. I don't want to be, as we say in English, a broken record and say exactly the same thing. I will say a comment about language. I'm sorry, actually, that I'm speaking in English, but because I do love languages very deeply, and Morse code. I do have a self. Very smart. I think we got it. The cell phone. Very smart. I appreciate that. That's a lesson I can learn. All right. So what I was saying about languages, I love languages extremely deeply, as some of you know, and I've studied Spanish. I haven't studied Spanish nearly as deeply as some other languages that I have studied and been very deeply involved with. But I think that if I were here for a month and practicing my Spanish on a daily basis, then I've been spoiled because everybody speaks such excellent English. I mean, I must say, it's very striking how very well people speak. I'm very impressed and glad, and I think it's a good sign for Chile that people speak English so well. But it's bad for me because it means I get no practice. I mean, because I'm a very pragmatic person when it comes to languages. If I speak a language better than somebody, then we should use that language. But if I speak it a lot worse, we shouldn't use it. It's as simple as that. And so I'm not going to speak to you today in Spanish because it would be stupid because I would not come across very well. But if I were here for a month and speaking only Spanish, I think I would dare. I do remember very vividly when I went to Italy and the first time I gave a talk in Italian. And I was terrified. But the truth is, my Italian at that time was only about as good as my Spanish is this time. At this time, my Italian is far better now. I've spent years in Italy, and it's changed. But by that first lecture, the only difference was, let's say it's my Spanish today, but the difference was that I spent 4 hours with somebody going over all the special vocabulary. How do you say this? How do you say this? How do you say? How would I say this? Is this grammatical? Can I say this? You know, blah 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 blah. 4 hours of practice, notes everywhere, and then I'm terrified. I went in and I gave the talk, and then from then on, that summer I was in Italy and I gave 10 more talks or 9 more talks in Italian, and that really helped me. It changed. So if I were here for a month, I'm sure at the end of the month I would start giving talks in Spanish, making lots of mistakes and stuff. But still, it would be okay. But not today. So I apologize for that. But anyway, it's a pleasure to be here. And so I've given. Yesterday, I gave a talk which I described as being about, in a certain sense, the Aconcagua. I used the Chilean now instead of Mount Everest. In some other context, I would say Mount Everest. But anyway, I gave a talk about very deep, earth-shaking analogies, or in one particular analogy by Einstein. But I did say at the beginning, maybe I should use some picture here. So if we look at the landscape out here, you know, we see big mountains like that. And it's like Einstein, I talked about this, and I said that's a great analogy. But then, below that there's some hills, and below that there's some hills, and then there's some little things. This is a hill too. I'm walking on a wire. It's about ½ a centimeter thick, and that could be called a hill as well. It's just a very low hill, but it's still a hill in a sense. And today's talk is about that kind of analogy. And my point is that these are very rare, but little tiny hills are very common. And in fact, so common that my claim is that every act of thinking is an analogy. And this is to be contrasted with the usual way that in cognitive science people think of analogy. I don't want to say everybody in cognitive science, because I don't like stereotyping or overgeneralizing, but if you go to a cognitive science conference, there'll be sessions on many things, and one of the sessions, among 20 sessions, will be called something like, correct me if I'm wrong, called analogical reasoning and problem solving. Does that sound familiar? Analogical reasoning and problem solving. And it'll be about analogies that are maybe not at this level, but analogies that are about this level. They'll be saying, like, if you want to solve this physics problem, you can't do it by your ordinary techniques. Maybe you bring in an analogy, and you solve it this way, and you make a mapping of this sort, and things like that. And it's always, the word reasoning is always attached. Reasoning, analogical reasoning is the standard phrase. And I've been fighting that phrase for a long time. And I've been saying, analogy is not reasoning. I mean, it can be, if you wish, it can be something involved in reasoning, but analogy is just connecting something with something similar. It's just noticing a resemblance. And it doesn't have to be in the service of any kind of reasoning whatsoever. It can be just a passing observation. It can be done unconsciously. It can create errors. Analogy is responsible for error making, and I don't think people would call error making a variety of reasoning. And so my talk is in a certain sense, I think of it as radical, in that if you say to people, Einstein thought by analogy, many people will say, oh, okay, what's new? Or if you say that great advances in science are made by analogy, they'll say, yeah, okay, big deal. We knew that already. It's not a radical thesis. If you explain some of Einstein's analogy, they may say, oh, that's wonderful, it's very interesting, I'm so happy to have learned about it. As I think people were yesterday, they learned something about Einstein's thinking. But I don't think anybody would say, he gave such a radical talk, he said that analogy is involved in science. I mean, nobody's going to say, what a radical new thought. But if I say analogy is involved in everything you think, many analogies per second, that's radical. That's not the cognitive science standard line. It's very different. And it's what I would like to try to persuade you of today, if I can do so. And I will say that this is the line of this book, which I can't read its title because it's pretty small, but it's Surfaces and Essences. And the subtitle, Analogy as the Fuel and Fire of Thinking, came out about a year and a half ago by myself and my good friend and colleague in France, Emmanuel Sondet. And Emmanuel and I have been thinking about these things in very parallel ways for many, many years. And we were lucky enough to meet each other at a conference in Bulgaria in 1998. And we found over the years that we had an immense intellectual resonance. And so eventually we decided to write a book about our common view of the, as I said yesterday, ubiquity of analogy in thinking, the omnipresence, if you wish. And there's one problem with this book, and this will be the end of my preface, and soon I'll get into the content. But there's one problem with this book, which is something that I've learned from reviewers and from readers also, but mostly some of the reviews. Even the positive reviews seem to miss the point of the book. Like the positive reviews will look at chapter 8, which is the last chapter, and they'll say, oh, it was a wonderful article about Einstein's thinking, and it showed all the analogies that Einstein used. And I'm thinking, well, we must have made a strategic mistake if that's what people get out of our book, because that's not the key point of our book. The key point is not to talk about the Everests of thinking or the Aconcagüas of thinking. That's icing on the cake. That's chapter 8. We're not working up to chapter 8 as the culmination or the climax of our book. But maybe we did structure it that way. Maybe we should have thought about it in a different way. So, in a certain sense, I would say that the real message of our book is in chapter 1. Okay, and then after that, the chapters 2 and 3 and 5 in particular really reinforce the message of chapter 1. But in some sense, chapter 1 is sort of what the book is all about. And people, for some reason that I don't quite understand, they read chapter 1 and they say, yeah. And they don't seem to see anything radical or new in it. And they sort of think that we're moving our way up to the big thesis at the end, which is chapter 8. And that's not the point. The point is really chapter 1 and 2 and 3 and 5, but principally chapter 1. And so that was a mistake we made in a sense, strategic mistake we made in a way. And I wish that people would pay more attention to chapter 1. But anyway, if you get this book, I'm not going to tell you read chapter 1 and quit. That would be sort of not a very good idea. But I would like you to please read chapter 1 with special care and think to yourself that at least the author, the one of the two authors, probably both of them, would say to you that this chapter is radical. It is disagreeing with the party line in cognitive science, which says that analogy is this little area that is covered in a session called analogical reasoning and problem solving. No! That's wrong. Divorce analogy from problem solving, divorce it from reasoning. Okay, that's sort of what the philosophy of our approach is. So, what kinds of analogies are there if we're not talking about these grandiose things, you know, Einsteinian thoughts or something? I'm going to begin with some that are actually not covered in chapter 1, but more in chapter 3, I think, just to give you some, sort of to ease our way into the more radical thoughts. So let me give you a nice story. This took place many years ago. It involved my late wife, Carol, we were somewhere, I think, in England, and for some reason, as I recall, she was writing out a check. Now, I can't even remember why this was happening, but it doesn't matter. She wrote a check out, and then she said, "Oh, drat, I botched it again." And what that meant was that she had signed with her maiden name, not with her married name. She had decided to change her name to my last name, but she had forgotten and signed with her maiden name instead. And so my friend Peter, who was, you know, maybe the check was being made out to him, I don't remember. Anyway, he said, "Oh, that's okay. Same thing happens to me every January." Okay. So what did he mean? I'm sure you understand what he meant, but just to spell it out to make sure. He did not mean that, you know, he had once had a different last name, and that every January he makes this mistake of writing the earlier name. He meant that every January, when he writes out checks or signs, it puts any date at all. It could be on a letter. It could be whenever he writes a date, he tends to write the year before. I mean, we all do that, right? And so that's what he was doing, to empathize with Carol. Now, firstly, I would like to point out that I don't think you will say that this is an example of problem solving, unless you want to say, oh, the problem was make Carol feel better. Okay, I mean, if you want to say that, okay. I don't think it's an example of reasoning either. It's not reasoning in any sense of, you know, deduction or anything like that. It was just a spontaneous moment of empathy where he abstracted a sort of a core essence. You know, our book is titled Surfaces and Essences, so he sort of saw beneath the surface. He saw beneath the surface to a sort of a more deep essence of it, and he found in his long-term memory, whatever you want to call it, his episodic memory, cases of things like that he did, and he was just trying to give her a sense of, it's okay, don't worry about it. You know, I feel for you. I do the same thing too. Okay, so there's Emmanuel and I have this name for this phenomenon where somebody says, I do that too, or the same thing has happened to me, or exactly the same thing happened to me one time. We call those Me Toos. And so I want to talk to you about Me Toos a little bit. So one time, here's another Me Too. But it's not literally Me Too. It's not that phrase. It's just, we just use that as the sort of generic name for it. So one time I was giving a talk about analogy making. This was back in 1981, a long time ago, at Caltech. And you know who Richard Feynman was, the physicist? Well, he was sitting right there.
He was sitting right there. But that's very interesting, right? He wasn't in Chile. Because in Caltech, how could he have been sitting right there? But you understand completely what I mean, right? I mean, I've just made a mapping of a big auditorium. Actually, it was an auditorium that held like 500 people, and it was on a slope. It was perhaps this wide, but it was much longer, and it was on a slope. And as I recall, the chairs were not movable, but they were, you know, sort of all attached to each other. And I don't know how many chairs there were, so there might, I mean, but still, it makes sense to say he was sitting right there. It might have been right there. I can't actually remember. But you understand what I'm saying. You understand. That's a kind of a me too. Again, it's not problem solving, it's not analogical reasoning. It's just telling a little anecdote, just an amusing fact that Richard Feynman was right there. And so I was telling some people yesterday, we were in well, what is that place that has the Slavic, very rich Chilean family that donated hall? Luxi? Yeah. Okay, we were downstairs in a cafe. You know that cafe, big cafe, much bigger than this room. And I was saying to some people that I was with, having a nice coffee, and I was saying I once had an art exhibit, and I said it was in a room about this big, really a big room. And then I said, and two things that I had done, and then I got up, for some reason I got up and I walked over to the table and I said that two of the things I did were right here. I mean, I was referring to a table in that cafe as the place where my certain pieces of art that I had done were. But again, it was just an analogy. Obviously it was false, but it was very clear what it meant. To be more mundane, if my son, if let's say I see that my son has something, he's been eating, you know, a pastry or something, and he has a crumb on his lip, and I say, you have something right here. You have something right here. He's not going to reach over and touch my lip. I mean, I do that kind of thing as a joke. Roberto says, you have something right here. I'll say, oh, do I? And I'll try to get it off. But it's just as a joke. But obviously, if I say you have something right here takes on a meaning which is not literal. Literally, it's a lie. It's false. Right? He doesn't have something right here. He has something right here, right, with quote marks. And so, once again, I just want to point out, if you wish to call this problem solving or analogical reasoning, I don't know. To me, that seems like a very bizarre notion of problem solving or reasoning. So I hope that you'll accept my idea that these are analogies that are just simply part of everyday communication. They're just part, and they jump spontaneously to mind. You don't think to yourself when you say you have something right here, oh, I'm making an analogy. I'm really sophisticated. You don't think to yourself, I'm such a deep analogical thinker. But I hope you will admit to yourselves that this is analogy. Is it? Is there some reason to object to that? Am I pushing the word analogy too hard? I hope not. So that's sort of beginning. That's sort of the beginning of these notions of how analogies come to us spontaneously all the time. Now, I think that in order to get to the topic of chapter 1, I'm actually going to jump to chapter 5, because chapter 5 reinforces the message of chapter 1. Not all of it, but the beginning of chapter 5 does. The beginning of chapter 5 is about error making. And error making of, you could say, two sorts. One sort is action errors. Are any of you familiar with the work of Donald Norman? Not his human interface or design things, but he's done work on he wrote a paper called Categorization of Action Errors, I believe, or Action Slips. Anyone familiar with that? He's also done work, he wrote a paper that had big influence on me, having to do with typing errors, computer modeling of typing errors. And that had, both papers had a big impact on me, but in particular the typing one did. But anyway, so action errors are when you do something mistaken, but it has nothing to do with language, or it could, but you know. And then there's the other type of error that is speech errors. So maybe I should give you an example, because it's one of my favorite examples in chapter 5 of an action error. And so I'll give you this example, even though it may not be exactly getting to chapter 1 immediately, but it's still a very nice example of an action error. And what I want you to see, again, is that here is analogy not being used in the service of any reasoning or problem solving. So here is the story. My son Danny was taking German in high school, and we had a friend named Christoph who was German, and he was a graduate student in cognitive science working with Rich Schifrin, if you happen to know him, and doesn't matter. But Christoph came every week to tutor Danny in German. And so one day he came a bit early, and he was a friend of the family, and he and I were standing in the kitchen. Danny wasn't yet home. He was about to come home, so we had to kill a little bit of time. Now, sometimes I paid Christoph before, and sometimes I paid him after. And at that particular time, I don't think I had any thoughts as to whether I was going to pay him before or after. But anyway, I paid him $20 each time for each session. So we were standing in the kitchen, and I said, "So, would you like something to drink?" And he said, "Yeah, sure. Could I have a glass of water?" And I said, "Well, come on. We have," and then I went to the refrigerator here, and I opened it, and I said, "Look, we have Coke, we have orange juice, we have cran-raspberry juice, we have milk, I can fix you some coffee or some tea, you know, whatever you want." He said, "It's okay, just a glass of water." And so I walked over to the cabinet, and instead of reaching up to the cabinet, which was right there, to get a glass, I can't explain why this happened, but I reached into my back pocket, I pulled out my wallet, and I unfortunately don't have a $1 bill. And I pulled out a $1 bill. I have a $20 bill. This is the wrong bill. This is not what I pulled out, but you have to imagine that this is a $1 bill. Okay, I pulled out a $1 bill, and I started handing it to him. And I looked at it. What the hell am I doing? What is going on? And I had no idea what I was doing. And then I realized it took me a few seconds to come to an understanding of what was going on. I had somehow activated the idea of paying him, I don't know why, and conflated it with offering him a drink. Both of them are giving him something. So there's an analogy between paying and giving somebody a drink. And giving him water, to me, was, if I can use a colloquial idiom, a very watered down kind of drink. I mean, it was, I had wanted to give him a nice drink, like Coke or coffee or juice or something, and he had insisted that I give him the minimal possible drink. And unconsciously, I converted that into the minimum possible bill. And I pulled it out of my wallet, and I was offering it to him, and I had no idea what was going on. No idea. But you can see that it was an analogy. It was a set of analogies. It was like giving him something, or giving him this and that were analogous, and then watering it down to the minimum level was an analogy, you know. And this was an incredible action error. And it was done by me in a certain sense, but me had no idea what was going on. Very interesting unconscious error. So that is probably my favorite action error that and you know, people complain to me because I write down their speech errors. And I tell them, come on, I write down my own speech errors, and I have a big collection, much bigger. I'm the biggest contributor to the speech errors. You know, don't feel bad that I'm writing down your speech error, because I'm the one who does the most, you know, in my collection. So my friends get used to it after a while, and you know, they accept it. But I want to talk about some speech errors and give you some examples. And why do I want to do this? Okay, now I will explain to you why I want to do this. It's because I want you to understand that the choice of every word that you make is made by analogy. Every word. Okay? That's a very radical thesis. I hope you will agree with that. Right? That is not the line of cognitive science, that word choice is made by analogy. I hope it will become the line of cognitive science, but it is not currently the line of cognitive science, but it's absolutely my line and Emmanuel Sonder's line. And so I'm going to try to give you a few examples. There are many more in the book, many more. And by the way, before I give you these examples, these are in English. Emmanuel and I wrote the book actually in both French and English simultaneously. And all of the examples in the French book are taken from, are genuine errors made by people speaking French, not errors made by people speaking English. We didn't substitute, we didn't translate. I mean, we translated in a very liberal sense. That is, we found counterpart examples in the other language. And we used those examples, and we talked about those examples. And so anyone who wants to translate the book into another language, like German or Italian or Spanish or something, will have to have a collection of speech errors. I mean, you can translate the story about me and Christoph. That's perfectly translatable. But speech errors, you can't translate. So you have to, some of them you can, but many of them you cannot. And so you have to have a collection that usually takes years to build up. Or else you go to the web, and if you're lucky, you can find a collection that has just the right kind of speech errors in that language, and you use that as your corpus. Anyway, so these are a few errors. Let's see, I don't know which one I want to pick, but I'll just go down them in order, at least in this case. So I was on a boat in Lake Geneva in Switzerland, and I was a big boat. There were a lot of people on it, some sort of cruise, thing. And there was another boat, a motorboat, that was going by us, not close, but visible, and it was pulling a person on a, I guess, what do they call it, a hang glider, is that what you would call it, or I don't know what you call those things, but way up there, like a kite, okay, you know what I'm talking about. And so there was a woman standing near me talking with a friend of hers, and she kept on referring to and this was in English, this was going on in English, she kept on referring to the thing that was attached to the boat and to the hang glider as a string. And I heard her say it over and over again, and the person she was speaking to never commented on that. And I thought, that's weird, that's certainly not a string. It's either a wire or a cable, but it's not a string. I don't know in Spanish what you would say. But you understand the difference? I mean, a string is a little thing that you would use for a kite. That's all. It could break trivially. What is it?
Cordero.
Cordero o hilo.
Hilo.
Un hilo would be a wire, right?
No.
Wire is
Cable.
that's wire.
The string is cordel o hilo.
Okay, anyway, well, I don't want to get into the details of the Spanish, but all I want to say is I want you to understand that this was definitely not a string. It is not a string if you take the word in a very strict sense. It is not a string. A string would break. I mean, a string could hold a kite, you know, made out of balsa wood and paper, but that's all. It's not going to hold a hang glider with a human being on it. It was just a completely wrong word. But it was made by analogy, right? The word was retrieved because a string is kind of like a cable or a wire. It's long and thin, and strings are used for kites, and this thing was kind of like a kite. And so it came to her mind, and she kept on using it, and the other person never even corrected it. I mean, or said, what do you mean, string? It was sort of like, in the context, it was perfectly acceptable, but it was a mistake. That's all I want you to understand. And it was a mistake made thanks to a sort of, a string is like a wire or a cable, in that it is very long and thin. It comes on a spool, right? It can be wound up, and it is used for tugging things, and it can have kites in the sky. There are all sorts of things to make this analogy work. And it's a good analogy, except if you literally think that's a string, you're wrong. It's a metaphorical string. So that's an example of word choice made by analogy. Now you might say, yeah, but it was very, that's not standard. My point is that yes, that is standard. What I want you to understand is that, let's say 95% of the time, maybe higher, 98, 99% of the time, when we make our word choices by analogy, our analogies are good. And therefore they produce, they summon up labels, words that is, that everybody accepts and that we agree. And so we don't notice the analogy because the analogy is invisible, because it seems like an effortless act. All we did was I looked at that and I called it a chair. Okay. So it seems like no analogy was involved. Well, yes it was, but it was a very, very simple analogy. Now let me give you some more examples of errors of word choice, and then we'll go into the idea of word choice as analogy, even when it's correct word choice. Okay? So first we'll talk about analogy as incorrect word choice. So here's me, I walk out of the pizzeria, and I'd ordered a pizza, or maybe I ate part of it and I got a box to take home the rest. And so I walk out and with a friend, and I want to take it home. And so we have to decide, how am I going to do this? And I have my bicycle there, and I say, oh, I'll take it home in my trunk. Okay, in my trunk. Now, what did I mean? I'll draw a great picture here. Here's my bicycle. I don't know, how does the bike look? Here's the seat, here's the handlebars, blah, 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 whatever. That's my bike. Great picture. Okay, I have a big basket here. In the back, this is the front. Bike goes that way. I have a big basket there. And what came to mind? Trunk. Why? What if my basket had been here? I don't think I would have said trunk. Because the trunk in the car is something that's in the back, except for maybe in Volkswagens or something, right? You know what I mean. Generally speaking, all the cars that I've had, actually I did have a Volkswagen, so I take it back, but most of the cars that I've had their trunks in the back. And a trunk is something that you use to carry things in. I mean, I didn't say I'll put it in the spokes of my wheel, or I'll put it in my seat, or I'll put it on my handlebar. I said, I used, or I didn't say, mean, in other words, I used a word that was summoned by analogy, a word that applies correctly to a car as a storage place in the back, behind the driver, except that this isn't the driver, this is the rider, if you want to speak English correctly. So that was the word that came to mind. Again, a word choice made by analogy. Okay, just an error, not problem solving, unless you think of word choice as problem solving. If you want to extend your notion of problem solving to include word choice, then yes. Yes, then it's analogical reasoning in service of problem solving. My sister and I were cleaning out the attic of our parents' house because we had the cellar. And there were boxes and boxes of junk. And we found some box that contained various knickknacks, I don't know. And there was, for some reasons, I don't remember what it was exactly, but it was either a toy or a little sculpture, I don't know what it was. But it was a sculpture or a toy that was a little whale, right? Was that ballena or something? Ballena. So it was that one of those things. And my sister referred to it as this little lion. Where did that come from? Well, she didn't say this little fly or this little kangaroo. So there must have been a reason, and in some sense, they call the lion the king of beasts, right? And say that it's the king of the beasts. And in some sense, the lion it's not the very biggest elephant. It's not the very biggest. You can see my thought process going on inside there. It's not the biggest animal in the jungle, or in the savanna, but it's a dominant animal, and in some sense, a whale is a dominant animal. And so my sister's word choice was governed by this idea of very big, important, salient, powerful animal. I mean, other than that, how can you explain it? It's crazy. She didn't say this little worm, she didn't say this little mosquito. I mean, and she wouldn't have. Because the analogy between a whale and a mosquito is very feeble. The analogy between a whale and a lion, although feeble, is stronger. And I can't explain it. It's just a bizarre error, okay? But it's an error, again, caused by analogy. Now, these happen fairly often. What I call these semantic, I actually have various names for them, but one name would be semantic proximity errors. Semantic proximity. And, you might think that these are very rare, or you might object that they happen only once or twice a day. Actually, I think they happen all the time. So I think much, much more often than once or twice a day. In my own speech, I haven't actually tried to monitor and measure rates. And again, it's going to vary according to my state of agitation and state of tiredness and all sorts of things. So there's no fixed rate. But I would say that if you averaged over a long period of time, I would probably make an error like that, of that sort, once every minute. However, it's very blurry as to what constitutes an error. Because here, let me give you a nice example. Find this one. So here it is. It's a nice example. It says, my friend Kelly said to me, I saw a beautiful bird in my yard, but I couldn't identify it. So I called up a bird watching friend and gave her as clear an explanation as I could. Now, the word explanation, is that an error? You see, it's not really the right word. Description. Description is what she meant. But she said explanation. Now, is that an error or not? Is it really an error, or is it just that she came close, and it's so close that it counts as okay? When is a word okay, and when is a word wrong? And there's not an exact boundary line. Okay, there's no exact boundary line. But I think this is a case where we would agree that on thinking about it, she did not retrieve the right word. It was an error, but it was an analogy, because explanations and descriptions are very similar things. And in this case, she retrieved semantic proximity error. Okay, so that's a nice example. I wanted to only point out to you that even saying what is a member of the category error is not a sharp black and white thing. Saying when something is an error or not an error is not a science, it's an art, if you wish. All right, now I want to give you some cases of children. And this is very important because, for two reasons. One is that it's about cases where children have a much smaller vocabulary than adults do. So the question as to whether something is an error on the part of a child, it gets really kind of a tricky thing. Because if a child doesn't know the word that an adult would use, but has a much more limited vocabulary, a child is going to be using the words that they have mastered to describe a situation that they're unfamiliar with, a novel situation. And but what they're going to be doing is they're going to be, in a sense, using words creatively. They're going to be, it's not really super creative, but it's stretching the meaning of a word. It's using a word in a way that seems right to them, but that they have never seen it used in just this way. So let me read you a couple of examples. And the other, I said there were two things interesting about this. That's one of them, is that here the question of whether it's an error or not becomes modulated by, is that the right word? Ask yourself. By the age and the size of their vocabulary. That has to be taken into account in deciding whether it's an error. The other thing that's interesting about this set of examples that I'm going to bring to you is bring the right word? Am I going to bring these examples? Think about that. Is that a speech error? I'm serious. I mean, I said that these examples that I'm going to bring to you. I guess it's a combination. It's bring to your attention or to present to you. But it's not really quite right to say these examples that I'm going to bring to you. But you see how blurry it is, you know. So when I say I make such an error once a minute, that's the kind of thing I mean. I just made one, I caught myself, and but it's very subtle. It's very tricky. Okay, the other reason that these examples are interesting is that they are verbs, not nouns. And this is where I want to start talking about choice of words. And when I say choice of words, I don't only mean nouns. Firstly, I mean verbs. Then we'll go on to other parts of speech, not just nouns and verbs. But now I want to talk about verbs. Okay, so here's perhaps our favorite example. I don't know, it's a very good example anyway. So this little girl named Camille says, she's 2 years old. These were collected by a psychologist in France named Karine Duvigneau, if you want to know who she is, in Toulouse. Camille might have even been her own daughter, I don't know. She says, I undressed the banana. We translated this. She said it in French, okay? But it's okay, this one is translatable. I undressed the banana. Now, I don't want to talk about whether this is an error so much. I mean, to us sophisticated people who know the idea of peeling a banana, it seems like an error. But we also have to, as I said, take into account that Camille, only 2 years old, doesn't know that verb. And to her, she's very familiar with the idea of undressing a doll or being undressed by her mother, you know, to go to bed or whatever. So undressing is the idea of, in a sense, peeling off the surface level of something. And it seems to apply, in this case, to the banana. And it seems a very nice thing to do, a very nice word to use for this event. So what I'm pointing out here is that the retrieval of that word came by analogy to circumstances that she had experienced before. And it came spontaneously, effortlessly, and it seemed, I'm sure that she felt it was the right word. I mean, and so this is the kind of thing that shows once again analogy as the source of word retrieval or labeling of situations. We have a few other examples here. We have a lot of examples. I don't know how many you want to give. This is a nice one. This is again in French, translated into English. This one is interesting. So Talia, who is 6, hears a noisy party upstairs in the apartment building. And the whole family hears it. And Talia's mother says that the next morning she's going to complain to the neighbors about their noisy party. And by the way, I almost said their lousy party, and you'll know where that comes from. It comes from noisy and loud and the word lousy. I almost said it, and I suppressed it at the last moment. But again, you see, that wasn't necessarily, it would have been a speech error had I said it, complain about their lousy party. Because notice that would have been, I'll talk about that in a moment. Let me write this down because I do want to talk about this. It's a nice example, it might as well be used. Noisy, loud, lousy. Okay, I'll talk about that one in a moment. But, so she's going to complain about this loud party, this noisy party. That's what the mother says to Talia. So the next morning, Talia asks her mother, so did you scold the neighbors about their party? Scold. Okay, I don't know how you say scold. What is it? What? No, that's scald. That's a different word. No, anyway, in French it would be gronder. T'as grondé les voisins du dessus. Anyway, my point is only that she used this funny verb that applies to children's actions, that a mother can scold a child for bad behavior, but a mother does not, or it's a motherly, it's a parental act. And the mother is not being a mother when she goes to the neighbors upstairs. She is going as a neighbor, not wearing her hat as a mother. And she's not going to scold the neighbors, she's going to complain, or she's going to chew them out, if we can say that in English. Chew them out means give them a lesson, a talking to, get angry at them, but not scold. Right? However, to Talia, age 6, whose vocabulary is still limited, it's a pretty good thing. By the way, I want to talk about Talia a little bit more because an example just occurred to me about Talia's speech. And you know, we were watching Talia all the time because Talia is Emmanuel's daughter. So she's now about 11 or 12, but she's more sophisticated now. But probably when she was about 5, I'm guessing, I don't remember, she started one day, or in a certain period of her life that might have lasted for a week or two, maybe even a month or two, she started using this French phrase, which, if you know French, I don't know what the Spanish phrase equivalent would be.
En cambio. En
Por
cambio.
el contrario? Probably
No, en
not.
cambio.
En cambio, that sounds better. En cambio, yes. Okay, that sounds like what she meant. Because she would say things like, oh, Mika is doing this, but Tom, par contre, il fait ça. You know, and it sounded so sophisticated to her to even say this thing. And by the way, in French, when you say it, you don't really, in spoken French, you don't hear the R-E. Par contre, et Tom, par contre, il a fait ça. Par contre. And it sounds like one word, like P-A-R-C-O-N-T-E. That's what it sounds like. And to her, I'm sure that's what it was, par contre. You know, it was one word, and it wasn't composed of two things. It didn't have an R-E at the end. You know, it was just par contre. And she would use this with such joy and enthusiasm because it was a new addition to her vocabulary, and she was mastering the use of what I will call par contre situations. No, seriously, this is not a joke. Why laugh? There are certain situations that call for par contre. There are certain situations that call for en cambio, right? There are certain natural situations when you say, this happened, this so-and-so did this, but en cambio, somebody else did that. Is that correct usage of en cambio? You know, and you can imagine a child's enthusiasm for such a, for acquiring such a thing, because a 2-year-old does not have that concept. And a 4-year-old has heard it, but hasn't yet figured out how to use it. They sort of hear it in the air, and they sort of, but a 5-year-old and a 6-year-old can start to insert it into their speech. And it gets very exciting. And you and I still do that with phrases, right, that we're learning, that we haven't heard before. I mean, I'm sure that when I get to be a better Spanish speaker, I'll enjoy saying en cambio. It'll be very fun, you know, for a week or so, and then I'll say, oh yeah, I've said that for years. And I won't be very proud of myself. But for a little while, I'll be very proud of myself and saying en cambio in just the right sort of, but you see, I had to check when you can use it. I had to say, is this, you know, somebody does something and then somebody else does something different. Can I say en cambio here? I have to sort of learn the boundaries of en cambio situations. And children learn those boundaries not so much by being taught, but they're never taught. They just hear it. They just pick it up. Just in the same way, nobody teaches them, now my child, a chair is something that has a back and 4 legs, and that I want you to know. And I'm going to give you quizzes on whether things are chairs or not. But we don't have quizzes on chairness, and we don't have quizzes on en cambio-ness, and we don't have quizzes on any word at all. Description, explanation, trunk, wire, thread, cable, kite. Nobody ever gives us tests as to whether we use those words correctly. We just learn them. And so it can be that Talia overused the word or the phrase par contre a bit, but when she would overuse it, she would gradually hear that people don't use that phrase very much in that way, and she would back away from it. And so we begin and we refine our categories, and we've come to find the boundaries, roughly, the rough boundaries that limit, that describe the semantic field or scope of a word. So description and explanation, that was a blurry case. Let me look at this noisy, loud, lousy one. What's interesting about this is that I was thinking that the neighbors had, I wanted to say a noisy party, but obviously, in my mind, simultaneously, the word loud got activated. So there was a competition for utterance, right? 2 things are activated at the same time in my brain. They're both trying to come out with speech channel. And so they both are trying to activate my muscles, my throat, my tongue, and so forth. And so if I could draw it, I mean, just as a metaphor, sort of, you know, it's a bar graph, and I'm going to say, here is noisy, the word noisy, and here is the word loud. And they're both activated fairly high. This is activation level. And there may be some other words that are activated that are much less activated. I don't know what they are, but I'm not going to worry about it. This is sort of represents the semantics, part of semantic space that I'm reaching into. And so these two are in strong competition with each other, and the battle is not resolved before the speech act starts. And so during the speech act, both of them contribute. And I didn't actually finish the speech act, but had I done it, it would have come out as lousy, and lousy would have been favored because it's actually an English word. So there would have been a little bit of a censor in my brain trying to say, oh, if it had been, like for example, if I had been trying to say loudy, my brain would have said, that's not an English word, you can't say that. So it would have caught it. It would have prevented it from being uttered, loudy. But lousy is an English word, and so it could slip through my censors. And it didn't, but it could easily have done so. So what I want to say about this kind of situation is when we're trying to find a word in a given context, needless to say, under time pressure, because speech is always under real-time pressure. We're under pressure to get the word out quickly, because otherwise somebody will steal the stage. They'll interrupt you if you stop speaking, and so you feel under pressure to say words, and so most of the time, say 90% of the time, your bar graph looks like this, with one very highly activated word. And so that is the word that gets said without any problem. But some small percentage of the time, as they say, 5% or 2%, I don't know what, it looks like this, where there are two or more highly activated words. And so there's a battle that takes place, and because they're both highly activated, the battle doesn't get resolved until actually the word, the non-word, or the hybrid word, has slipped out, and revealing what was going on behind the scenes. You have a question?
Yeah, I was thinking, I don't know if in English you say when you have a word, there's holding the tongue.
The tip of my tongue.
Yeah, so what's the
Well, that's a long story. I can't. If you really want to know, a beautiful book to answer that question is the book Sparse Distributed Memory. By Pentti Kanerva. That will answer your question. That will answer the question about the tip of the tongue phenomenon. I mean, it's a beautiful book. But my point here is that case where words are blended or mixed together reveals to you, or reveals to the listeners or whoever you want, it reveals to the world the fact of what was going on inside your brain. Correct speech usually does not reveal so much as to, I mean, of course it reveals what was going on in your brain in terms of revealing the semantic content of what you were thinking, but it doesn't reveal the mechanisms of word choice. But what's beautiful about speech errors, whether they're revealing the using the word string instead of wire, or trunk instead of basket, or so forth. All of those reveal analogical processes, and this reveals another aspect of the process of word choice, which is that there is a fight going on at all times. Every word choice is a fight. It's just that most word choices are fights like this, where there's very little competition. So there's a quick winner, and when the word gets pronounced, it doesn't sound, it doesn't come out long, it doesn't come out blended with something else. However, there's a sort of an intermediate case between this and this, which is where the word gets slightly altered in pronunciation. Like a vowel may shift a little bit, or a consonant may become voiced instead of unvoiced, or vice versa, which are very, very small blends. They show that, but there's something going on inside my head. I don't know what. That made me say they so instead of they show. Don't ask me what, but that's a perfect example of it. There was some blend going on in there that I can't explain that modified the SH sound. Anyway, modifications of sounds are examples of blends that are very subtle. And they can be modifications of consonants, they can be modifications of vowels, they can be shifts of accent or stress, they can be hesitations, that is lengthening, prolongations of a sound, and so forth and so on. All of these things count as varieties of speech error. And they all reveal the fact that in the act of choosing every single word, you are making analogies. You're dipping, you're trying to retrieve something that comes to you through your previous experience with the world. You're reaching in. I think what I need now is to make a little chart. I don't know, chart isn't the right word. Yeah. I don't know what is the right word though. I just want to talk a little bit about making analogies and categorizations. And then I think I'll conclude, because I know that what we're going to do is have a question and answer session. That was probably just. We're going to have a question and answer session. That's a bit of a tongue twister. Question and answer session. Right afterwards, and you'll be able to ask me many questions, and I'll be able to talk to you about many more of these ideas. So I don't need to present everything in this lecture. But I do want to draw a little picture that may help in understanding some of what I'm trying to get across. And that has to do with the way analogy is often conceived and the way categorization is often conceived. And I want to show you the distinction that you may make in your mind between analogy making on the one hand and categorization on the other hand is not a good distinction. Okay, that the two are the same process. Okay, so in order to do that, I'll draw a picture, the naive picture, let's say, if you wish, of, I don't know how to say it. But anyway, analogy making. So analogy making, let's see, I'm going to do this. Okay, here's a situation. I won't, it's not a picture, I won't draw a picture. Situation one is here. Situation two is here. And so here's a person's head. And situation one is mirrored inside the person's head by some kind of mental structure or mental representation. And situation two is also mirrored in the person's head by some kind of mental structure. Now, let's say that situation one, let's say situation two is something from long ago that is in your long-term memory. So it's dormant. It's not active. And situation one is something that you're just facing right now. So it's fresh. And so this is an old representation that is dormant somewhere. And this is a new representation that has just been created. So the new representation, in order to, we always want to kind of, how to say it, relate to things that are new to us in terms of things that are familiar. We always want to find things that are familiar. We want to say to somebody who tells us a story, oh, the same thing happened to me just the other day. Or, you know, I once heard of a friend who that happened to, or something. We always are looking for ways of relating the present new thing to things that we've experienced before. So, when situation one comes in and this representation is built, it goes off, in a sense, in search of other situations that are similar to it or analogous to it. And it can build up a kind of a mapping. I'm not going to try to describe this at all. So this looks like what analogy making is, okay? That's sort of what we might say analogy making seems to be. Now let me draw a picture of what you might say categorization is. So it's very similar. So here's situation one, but there is not going to be a situation two. And I could have put R1 here in representation of R2. Here we representation 2. So here we have the mental representation of situation 1. And it tries to find something. So situation 1 might be that chair. And so it goes in and finds a concept here which it connects to, and this concept is the concept chair, let's say, and so it applies that label, it categorizes situation 1 as a chair. So this does not look exactly like that. Obviously, I've made the two pictures different. What, however, I can do to make them look the same is to remind you that this category was not given to us by God. Unless you're a Jerry Fodor and believe in such things. But this category was built up in our brains by exposure to chairs. And so, in fact, there are a lot of things that, you know, I won't label them, but situation 2, situation 3, situation 4, and many others that created our concept of chair. Okay? So this looks a little bit more similar now to that. Right? It looks more similar because now we have stuff on the outside of both representations creating the representation. This is a dormant thing because chair is not always active in my brain. Most of the time it isn't, hopefully. But under certain circumstances, chair gets activated. So now these are looking more similar. The only thing is that this has a bunch of things here, and this has just one thing here. Well, let me first of all remind you that 1 is a number. So there's not a vast distinction between this and this, because 1 is a number. But secondly, it's very hard to really distinguish between, if I say this, I've got to give some nice example. Let's take the example of Peter saying to Carol, oh, that happens to me every January. Okay, that sounds like an analogy, right? Not a categorization. Right? However, he said every January. So is that one thing, or is it many things? Every January sounds to me like many things. So you see, what seems to be an analogy is actually looking just like this. Here's Carol signing with her maiden name, and here's Peter putting the wrong year in many different years, and he's creating this notion of putting the wrong year. So this picture actually applies to analogy making. And similarly, this picture can apply to categorization just as much. If you've only seen something one time and then you see it another time, this is an exact picture of it. You've seen one example of it and then another example comes. So what I'm trying to get you to understand here is my viewpoint, and Emmanuel's viewpoint, about the distinction between categorization and analogy making, which is that there is no distinction. I'll give you one last example and then I'll conclude. I have tons and tons of other nice examples, and probably I'll be able to use some in the question and answer period. But I'll just give you one example, because this is an example that struck me in Emmanuel's book. He wrote a book in 2000, I think 2002, which was based on his doctoral thesis in, I guess it was in cognitive psychology, in Paris. And he was trying to show that in his book and his thesis that categorization and analogy making are the same thing. And he used one example that was very telling, I thought, that came from the English language. Interestingly enough, this is a case where French does not use the expression, and so it may not work in Spanish either. But let me tell you the case in English. You know the Aesop's fable, or maybe you don't. That's the point. I don't know, but there is an Aesop's fable about the fox who wants some grapes, and who goes to try to get the grapes, jumps and jumps, they're on a trellis or something, and jumps and tries to get the grapes and can't get them, and in the end says, oh well, it didn't matter because they were probably sour anyway, or I didn't even want them. They were probably sour, or maybe just says they were sour. Who would ever want those grapes? They were sour. And so in French, the fable exists. Les raisins sont trop verts is the usual French. The grapes are too green. Anyway, I don't know, how it goes in Spanish, but my point is that in English we have come to use the phrase sour grapes as an isolated semantic unit, as a category, you might say. So when somebody says something like, I didn't get to go on that trip, but probably just as well because I have so much work to do these days. And you say, oh yeah, sour grapes, right? I mean, it's sort of like you said you wanted to go on the trip, and then for some reason you couldn't go, so now you're rationalizing it. Now you're saying it's better that you didn't go on the trip. And so you're saying, so we say sour grapes. Now the question is, what is going on? Is this a category of things that belong in the category sour grapes, or is this an analogy to the Aesop's fable situation? And I will simply leave it to you to think about it and to accept the idea, or at least to think about the idea, I hope you will accept the idea, that they're one and the same thing. That making that analogy to the fable and calling that situation a sour grape situation, those are the same cognitive act. Categorizing something as sour grapes and making an analogy to the fable are identical. And that is a beautiful example, I think, of our thesis. And I realized that I gave you a promise and I didn't carry it out, but I'm not going to carry it out now, but I will later if you wish in the question and answer session, which was that I was going to go beyond nouns and verbs, and I was going to talk about other parts of speech, and I'll be happy to do so, but at this point I will draw to a conclusion. Thank you. Oh, there.
In the comments, in the situation here, many times you explain about the error speech and laughing. You comment in the humor sense and speech errors.
Comment about humor.
And speech errors, because recently when you say that humors are intentional speech errors.
No. Okay, let me see if I can make some comments. You do tend to laugh at many speech errors because they do strike us as humorous, and some of them strike us as humorous. A bit, not very humorous. I mean, they're not good jokes. I mean, if I call my bike's basket a trunk, nobody's going to laugh. If I point it and say, that's my trunk, I'm not going to be a good stand-up comedian. When we put a frame around that speech act, it becomes funny somehow. But many errors are not funny. When Kelly said explanation instead of description, we're not going to, bust our gut, as we might say in English. We're not going to fall off our chairs laughing, and think that's an extremely humorous conclusion. So I would say that the majority of speech errors are not funny. But some are. And there are some that are extremely funny. Let me see if I can give you an example. This one, I'm trying to think of ones that don't depend on the English language. So I think this one is good if I can find it quickly in the index. I think I might be able to. Excuse me for this pause just a second, because I want to find a very nice speech area that I really like. Okay, here it is. So a tourist in England, I don't know who picked this one up, by the way. All of these are real. All of these are ones that either I or Manuel or my friend David Moser or a handful of friends have collected over the years. They're all friends. So they were, I guess, in London, and somebody points at some building and says, "Is that Buckminster Palace over there?" Now, what is Buckminster Palace? It's supposed to be Buckingham Palace, or Westminster Abbey, or Buckminster Fuller, the guy who invented geodesic domes and after whom fullerenes are named, if you know that term in chemistry. But you've heard of Buckminster Fuller? Yes? No? He's a very famous person in America. And so we have Buckingham Palace, Westminster Abbey, and Buckminster Fuller, all combined in one smooth, almost perfectly normal sounding phrase, and probably most people wouldn't even notice it. Is that Buckminster Palace over there? Oh no, it's over there. It's just like, you don't even hear the error. But if you actually hear it, you do want to laugh. It just seems very funny to confuse all these three things at once. And so, one last comment about I don't know, it's not really about speech errors, but it's about people who make puns on, I don't know what to say exactly. It's just that the activity of making puns, of playing with words, involves a very focused, strongly focused attention to the sounds of words and to the way that a word can be heard as decomposed in non-standard fashions, and or a word or phrase can be decomposed in a non-standard way. And if you are fond of making wordplay, you are constantly doing this as a sort of a background process in the back of your mind. There is a sort of an agent, or if you wish, an autonomous agent that is acting all the time, hearing words in weird ways and trying them out as little jokes in your head, and then seeing if they pass the censor. That is this a good enough joke to say, or is this obvious, trivial? And for beginning punsters, there is no such censor, and they produce all sorts of miserable pieces of wordplay. But gradually, if they're good, if they're sensitive, they develop a censor that cuts off the worst 90% or 95% and only gets the cream of the crop. So, it's, I don't know if this is related to speech errors, but you did ask about humor, and I wanted to comment a little bit about humor because I think it's related in some way. But I don't think that speech errors per se are a humorous phenomenon, although some are.
I mean, here, there. First question is,
wait a minute, first question, we can have multiple questions.
there is a pretty small one.
All right.
Or brief one. Do you remember the most significant speech ever made by a politician you ever heard?
Well, I remember one that is famous, but I don't know if it really is, really was a speech error, but it's the John Kennedy Ich bin ein Berliner. Is that the one you know? That's one. I don't know. There may have been others. There are probably hundreds of interesting. Berliner apparently means some kind of donut. As well as a person who lives in Berlin. So Ich bin ein Berliner. He's in Berlin. Trying to say I'm with you, folks, and he says I'm a donut. But I think that's exaggerated because, as far as I know, Berliner means a person, a resident of Berlin. So it could be heard as a speech error, but I don't think it really is. Maybe somebody else knows German sufficiently well to contradict me or correct me.
The other one, what do you understand in metaphor? Do metaphors immediately also work like analogies?
Okay. I'm not going to go into this in great detail. I'll simply say that to me, metaphor and analogy are essentially the same thing. It can be like saying, I've given you a talk about noises, and now you say, can you tell us something about sounds? And what's the difference between noises and sounds? And I said, well, they're pretty much the same thing. Every noise is a sound, and every sound is a noise. I mean, it's true that sometimes I say sound and I don't say noise. Again, as I use the word sound, I'll label something with the word sound rather than with the word noise. And other times I'll label something with the word noise rather than with sound. But every sound is a noise and every noise is a sound. Every metaphor is an analogy and every analogy is a metaphor. So to me, it's true that there's a slight difference in flavor. When would you call something a story? When would you call it an allegory? When would you call it a fable? When would you call it an anecdote? When would you call it an episode? When would you call it an event? Etc., etc. When do you call something a region? When do you call it a district? When do you call it an area? When do you call it a zone? I don't know. I can't define what a zone is as opposed to a region or a district or an area. I just use them. I use those words. And the same with metaphor and analogy. I agree that it's an interesting question, but I don't have an answer for it offhand. It's worthwhile exploring, but I haven't explored it very quickly. So it's for the future.
Here?
Hi.
Hi.
I have again two brief questions. The first one is how this model of analogy relates to blending the documents and similarities, and we'd like to know how you stand with this particular theory. And the second question is related to the particular analogy used for the book. Essences beyond surfaces. And I would like to know how it sits or relates to all the theories that push memory outside the head. All those who are starting to think that the world might be announcing memory. Because it seems very Freudian to me, the model of the mind you have and how memory works.
Freudian, I don't know what Freudian means. Is that good or bad? Is Freudian good or bad?
I wouldn't say it's good or bad, but maybe if I can rephrase the question, is what are the pragmatic implications of the image of the mind you're proposing? Or whether analogy is something that is beyond, whether there is a deictical aspect to the what? A deictical aspect to the model of, or is it just an analogy within all the analogies?
Your question is a little bit beyond my understanding of capabilities, but the first question I can relate to. The first question he asked is, how does this relate to Fauconnier and Turner's theory of conceptual blending? And in case you're not familiar with that, there are a lot of books about conceptual blending. They begin, in a sense, with Fauconnier's book, Mental Spaces. And then he's written some books, or edited some books with a linguist named Yves Sweetser. They're about blending in thought and language. Maybe that's the title of one of them. And then the most, well, maybe not the most recent, but the one that I know of most recently is Fauconnier and Turner. That's Gilles Fauconnier and Mark Turner wrote a book called The Way We Think, which is referring to, we means human beings, not just although I think it's a pun. I think deliberately they use that title, meaning the way the two of us think about thought. So it's a cute title. And the book, let me say that I find their writings very stimulating. I'm a good friend of both Gilles Fauconnier and Mark Turner, especially Gilles. I think that the examples that they use in their books are unbelievably stimulating. They're beautiful, beautiful examples. They talk about the idea of blending two concepts. I mean, their canonical picture is a picture that I'll erase something here. Their canonical picture is something that looks like this. Two situations that are different, they often get blended into a third situation. Some elements, I'll put X's here to be elements of this situation, and O's to be elements of this situation. And there are some X's and some O's in this one. In other words, some stuff gets imported from that situation, some stuff gets imported from that situation, gets blended, and then they also try to make what they call a generic, these are called spaces. So this is a space 1, space 2, blended space, generic space. I mean, the details I can't go into. The generic space is sort of what these two spaces have in common, sort of like an abstraction that they share, and this is something that they're blended into. They like to say that conceptual blending is everywhere, as I like to say analogy is everywhere, and they say that conceptual blending is not analogy. They say, whenever I say analogy is everything, they say, Doug, you're wrong. Blending is everything. Analogy is only part of the picture. And so I disagree with them because the way I see it is many analogies are blends. We talk about it a lot in this book here, and I'm not going to go into details, but lots of analogies that we produce in everyday life are blends. I give you one example, just one, okay? I do a lot of dancing, and I take lessons. And so I'm over at the dance studio, and my teacher's name is Sandy. And so Sandy and I say, we're going to learn a new move today. And so we said, let's go to the web. Let's find a nice salsa move. This is salsa that I do. And so let's find a nice salsa move. And so we find one, and we are looking at these two people on the screen. And so, you know, if we were speaking extremely cleanly and precisely, we would say things like, he does that and she does that, and so I should do this and you should do that. But what often, all the time, I say things like, let's see, okay, so I'm doing that and you're doing that, or I'm doing that and she's doing that. So I map myself onto the guy on the screen and I say I, talking about him, but I'll say she, not Sandy. Or I might say, so you're doing that, and he's doing that. In other words, I'm freely mixing my pronouns. I use the pronoun he to talk about myself. I use the pronoun I to talk about him. I use the pronoun she to talk about Sandy herself instead of you. Or I'll use the word you to talk about the woman on the screen. And so the two situations are being blended in my mind. There's clearly an analogy. Obviously, I map onto the guy, and she maps onto the woman, and that's an analogy. But we blend and blur without any problem. And this is still an analogy. It's just a sloppy analogy. So to me, sloppy analogies are everywhere. We do them all the time. They're still analogies. They're just sloppy. Now, I'm not saying all blends are sloppy. That's not my point.
Are there blends or analogies that are not blends?
There are analogies that are not blends. So I would claim, yeah, that blending is a special case of analogy. It's a case where it's where elements of one situation are used in talking about another situation, and vice versa. It's where the two situations are conflated in your mind a bit. And this happens a lot. So in any case, what I would say is I can't answer your question in any definitive manner. I can answer it for myself, and my answer is blending is just one variety of analogy. But you might not accept that. All I can say is I recommend to you to look at the books by
and I think there is a distinction that is somehow not captured with your blending of notion of category and analytics. I will illustrate that with one of your examples. Case of the 2-year infant who says creatively, "Ma'am, please undress the banana for me," or something like that.
Yeah.
What's going on there, more or less, is it's a creative act. He or she hasn't used, say, ever the word undress. In that case, say it's the first case. Because there is somehow an analogy with the undressing a dog, the general undressing situation. So she will say that expression. Just as a parenthesis, there is much more correction going on than we think. For example, it's very common that mothers will laugh, and then they will say, no, it's peeling the banana. Peeling the banana. But that's the psychoanalysis. And the interesting thing is that even if she is not saying a correction, the baby sooner or later, the infant sooner or later will use the right word. That's true. So going back to this, what I want to say, there is a sort of creative act. First time she or he is using it, she will give it a chance. and say the word undressed. But after a while, that word will be stored in long-term memory with the precise meaning it is used for fruits. And he or she will never use again the word undressed. That is completely. See, somehow you are changing the conceptual landscape of lexical concepts. So then, when she will use the word, precise word, it will be different because it will be this creative act of saying something like, well, this looks like, say, healing, or this reflects like behavior. It's automatic. The word is stored in memory. The situation matches the lexical concept, and it is activated and pronounced. So I think there is a difference between this stage in which you have this sort of creative situation. Things are not stored in memory yet, so they are not available for reference-like behavior.
I think I get your point. Firstly, I don't really agree with you that the words are automatically and reflexively used, and I don't agree with your statement that they're precise. But I understand what you're saying. I agree in part with it. But let me simply say that if your theory were correct, you wouldn't make any speech errors. I wouldn't have ever have said trunk when I meant basket. The woman would never have said string if she had meant cable or wire, etc., etc. Over and over again, millions of speech errors are made. And you say, oh, but we don't do that. Well, I said, but what we do, I'm sorry we do. And the other is to say that to use the word precise suggests that categories have exact boundaries. Categories do not have exact boundaries. And so you can't talk about precise use of words. I mean, it's true, what you can say is that a category has a kind of a, I mean, if I draw a circle here, it's because I don't have a chalk. If I had chalk, what I would do is I would draw something very dense here, and less dense here, and less dense here, and less dense, and less, and less, and less. And I would say that's the nature of a category. And I would say things that are down in here, you could say, yeah, this is a correct usage of the word. But when you get out here, then the question is this correct usage or not? It starts to get blurry. And then when you get out here, it says maybe it's sort of an error. When you get out here, you can say it's definitely an error. But it's not like there's some kind of precision here. Things are not precise in language. Categories simply are not precise. Lastly, about the word creative. Again, you're suggesting that when you say that the child had never applied the word undress, well, I don't know if I'm going to say exactly what you said, but I'll try to imitate repeat what you said. You said something like the child had never before applied the word undressed or seen the word undressed used in reference to a banana. Okay, that's true, but we use words all the time in situations that we have never encountered before. That's the nature of the world. The world is always throwing situations at us or putting us in situations that we have never encountered before. And we don't necessarily have labels for everything that are precise. We reach into our memory and try to find as good a label as we can under the pressures of real-time, conversation. And often we come up with interesting word choices that, I don't know. Let me give you an example. My son has an aquarium in which there are just some shrimp, small shrimp. And when he goes away, sometimes I have to feed the shrimp every other day. And so one day I was speaking to myself. I don't always speak to myself, but I was. And I was walking into his room and I said, banquet for the fishies today. What kind of thing am I saying? Banquet? Fishies? Weird. They're not fish, they're shrimps, and fishy, why did I say fishy? And then banquet? What am I talking about? But I said it. I mean, I can't deny that I said it to myself, banquet for the fishies. And I should have said food for the shrimp. But, you know, that's what came out in real time. Just, I said that. So, you know, I don't usually talk about feeding the shrimp. And if somebody else had said it, you could have said, oh, that's the first time they'd ever used the word, or they'd ever thought about feeding shrimp. And I don't know. Well, I'm not being terribly articulate. What I want to say is that, in truth, every situation is fresh, is different. Every single situation is different. It's just that when I see a chair like that, it's not very different from chairs that I've seen before. So we tend to think, oh, that's a routine situation. But it's not exactly routine because I've never seen that kind of chair exactly before. But it's just so similar to some chairs that I've seen before that we think it's a trivial connection. It's not trivial. It's still actually reaching in and seeing behind the scenes, not behind the scenes, but seeing something deeper that is hidden by the surface level. Because I could get very distracted by all sorts of features of that chair that I've never seen before. But instead I go straight for its abstract structure, and so I don't get distracted. But, you know, it's a non-trivial cognitive act, even so. So I would urge you to think hard about the nature of categories, the fact that they're certainly not precise, that what might strike you as a creative use is not necessarily really creative. It is just applying a word to a situation that has not been seen before, and perhaps stretching it a little bit further than the person usually does. But we're always stretching words, a little bit. We're constantly stretching words, but we don't notice it. Because most of the time the situations seem to us very ordinary and bland, but once in a while we'll encounter things for which the labels that we use are quite creative. Creative in a sense. That is, we stretch a word so far that other people might say, oh, that's a clever use of the word. But it may not be really creative, and it all depends on our own experience. Maybe for one person, it would be a trivial, almost not a stretch, whereas for another person, it would be a big stretch. We don't all have the same flexibility of concept or the same experience, the same set of experiences with the world. So, I mean, I appreciate what you're saying, that there's a slight amount of creativity, and I certainly agree with you that the word peel will come to dominate in certain kinds of situations, and that it will suppress the use of undress, absolutely. The word undress will probably not be used very often, if ever again. But you can't say it'll never be used, because it could be used, just like I used the word trunk instead of basket. Or the woman used the word string instead of wire or cable. I mean, we all make mistakes. Why did my sister call a whale a lion? For God's sake, it's ridiculous. Et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so I tried to answer your question.
So I'm going to be the bad guy. This is the last question, and then we have to close this round.
Yeah. As you know, we all know that to avoid mistakes in the outside world, we just need the proper agreements, the proper protocols. As you know, scientific world is the best example to avoid mistakes that are made by instrumental mistake or errors or any type or any process or analogy can be solved by the proper agreement. But the problem that I see is when we move to the psychological world, the more inner world of that we live, that reality is more, is a complex set of analogies that cannot be solved just by appealing to the right protocol, or the right, like in the scientific world, or appealing to the right agreement. Because after all, you know, if we agree that something is named such and such, then there's no error in that case. But inside, in what we are, as you in your book, you know, I'm Strange Look, is more difficult because there is not an outside world that we can refer to. So there is not an easy way to get out of a kind of a very closed loop, a very that can tell us why we have all these mistakes. Because in the psychological world, we have terrible mistakes that have dire consequences. You know, we have a very conflicted world. So to make this practical, it seems like in the psychological world, there is not a way to solve errors by analogy, but by awareness. And I wonder if you agree with this. By some state that go beyond the system, as Gödel in the theorem suggests, that go beyond the system. Why we have been unable as a culture to solve the big error, that the conflict error, which is we are in conflict, right? So this is a big error. I mean, it's a dire error that has. And my suggestion is that we are in a closed loop that we cannot solve because we don't have a referential world. We cannot solve that that by agreement, because we have been unable to, and the analogical process is very limited.
Okay, let me try to answer. You know, I don't agree with you at all that the scientific world has no errors in it. Most papers in science are probably wrong, and they just get forgotten. You might say that's what you meant. That is that individual scientists can make errors, but that that a big science like physics as a whole doesn't make errors, because it eliminates all bad ideas and only selects the good ones.
Yeah, no, I agree. Approximation, of course.
But even so, there are still huge debates within all sorts of sciences. There's debates in physics whether string theory is valid or junk. There's debates in biology about whether there's such a thing as punctuated equilibrium or something, or whether group selection exists or doesn't. I mean, I don't, you know, there's debates in psychology, tons of debates in psychology, and so forth. It's true that science tends to try to find a route, but I think also societies try to find, I mean, when you say the conflict, I assume you meant political conflict, like
social, political, religious, any conflict.
Well, but I was thinking,
family,
the Middle East situation, or whatever you want.
Personal conflicts.
Personal conflicts, yeah. I mean, I think we all, to deal with political things, I mean, it seems to me that although there have been and still are horrendous wars, it seems to me that very slowly over the period of the last 1,000 years, we have come to somehow understand the nature of conflict to some degree. We do have a lot of peace in this world. I mean, I don't know too much about South America, but I get the impression, correct me if I'm wrong, that the countries get along pretty well together. That the biggest fight is Argentina versus Brazil in the soccer match. You know, I mean, that's not a big conflict, right? And that's hundreds and hundreds of millions of people. So it seems to me a lot of progress has been made. It's true that there's a lot of fights in this world, but they're limited to certain regions by and large. And we have the United Nations, and we're making progress. As for interpersonal conflicts, I think that we have books, we have theories all sorts of theories about how to get along with people and so forth. There are books out there in the marketplace. I've learned from books. A lot of people today have psychotherapy of one sort or another that tries to help them find their way when they're feeling very lost. I've certainly done that. And it seems to me that there are ways of externalizing our problems, that is, voicing it to other people and having feedback and gaining some external advice that is in a way like having the United Nations or something. It seems to me that didn't exist perhaps 100 years ago. It seems to me we're making slow, moderate progress, and it's not all that different from the world of science, where there's also huge amounts of conflict. And a lot of things that go on in science today, I think, are complete hogwash, nonsense. They
give an example?
Well, I personally feel, but I'm not going to argue it, but I personally feel that string theory is an example of that kind of thing. Okay, but there are probably many others that I could point at. One thing that I don't like in the world of psychology, but I'm not saying it's hogwash or nonsense, but it's something, it's a trend that I don't like, is the immense pressure to always use fMRI everywhere. You know, it's like you can't get a job unless you have fMRI in your resume or something. To me, it just seems like there are a lot of bandwagons. Do you know the term bandwagon? I mean, there are a lot of bandwagons, things that are trendy, and they'll pass. And 20 years from now, they'll say, oh, well, why did anybody care about that? But, you know, for a while, everything has got to be this, got to be that. Everybody's got to get on the bandwagon, otherwise they don't. So, you know, science is filled with bandwagons and trendiness and so forth. So it seems to me the whole human world is the way, is full of conflict and stuff, but even so, we manage most of the time to get along pretty well. And I would say that's the same in social, interpersonal, political, and scientific terms. That's what I see.
Okay, thank you very much, Doug.
Hello.
¿Estás filmando acá?
Se arrancó.
Arrancó, pero... Ah, pues está grabando todavía. Magnífico, magnífico. Eso me hace muy feliz. Muy bueno.
Strike.